listen to what I am saying? Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. Can you please let me know if you are having any technical issues or if you can hear me? I think we're having some issues. Okay, I think everything is ready. Okay, so we are going to start. I'm really happy to know that you have been. I know that this is almost the end, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you again. Now we're going to talk about different topics. But we are going to continue talking about theory of change. So I am going to talk about gender sensitive evaluation. I started looking for new information, or maybe you had already, maybe you already had some information about this, and we are going to talk about the basic and we're going to talk about gender sensitive evaluation. And if you have any question or if you want to add something, please feel free to do so so that we can have a very helpful class for you. So we are going to start. First, we are going to talk about gender focus. Given the fact that you have already seen this, we are going to define gender, and maybe we have some misinterpretations concerning gender, because many people think that gender has to do with women, just as if women exists without men. So I think it is very important to talk about gender and also to talk about gender sensitive evaluation in public policies and also in the cycle of public policies. So, as a definition, what is gender? Gender refers to the roles and to the set of socially constructed roles, relationships, personal traits, attitudes, behaviors, values, relative power, and influence that a given society considers appropriate for men and women in a different way. We talk about men and women in a biological way. And the first thing that we say has to do with socially constructed roles and relationships. We know, for instance, if we analyze this from a biological point of view, so far we know that the ones who have babies are women. In some cases, maybe we have seen that some men have been able to breastfeed. This is something unusual. But in this case, we can see that biology is something very important. And also, it might seem that almost every single activity and roles have been constructed in a social way. There are many, there is a lot of information concerning gender focus, and this has to do, for instance, with care. Traditionally, it is thought that women are in charge of taking care of children because they are the ones who gave birth and they have a different relationship. However, of course, men can also take care of children just as a woman. So, of course, this is very important to take into account because it is very important to analyze how these roles and relationships had been constructed. And this has led to the fact that a gender has more power than another one, or maybe one is more powerful than the other one regarding a society. There are also related topics, for instance, indigenous topics. For instance, in my case, there is for instance, there are some men that do not allow women to go to some places because And when we analyze this in further detail, what happens is that men have a role in communities, a power role, and they understand Spanish, and the women in these communities only understand indigenous. So in this case, we have a role that for men has been granted, and this is translated into the fact that they can relate they have different interactions in comparison with women, for instance. So as I was saying, biological sex has to do with anatomic and genetic characteristics, and gender focus says that gender is an identity that is learned and acquired and that can change through time, and that can change within communities and cultures. Gender has to do with the fact with how a relation happens, for instance, between men and women, because gender doesn't only refer to men or women, it refers to the relationship between both. So here I have a question. How many genders do you know or are you aware of? Can you answer this question? How many genders do you know, or how many genders are you aware of? I think it is very obvious, right? Women and men. But if you have seen concerning the LGBT fight, we have more genders besides women and men. And in accordance to the health organization, we have many genders, for instance, pansexual, and many genders. We even have more than five, and Milton says five, but according to the health organization, they have 20 genders, and I think that this is something very important and something that we can analyze later. So in this case, we talk about public policies, gender sensitive public policies. And I think it is very important because how can we include a gender focus in decision making? How do we make sure that this is a gender sensitive public policy? So we're going to talk about decision making with a gender perspective. So this means that we need to include a gender perspective in the process of evaluating the consequences, both for women and men, of any planned activity conducted by the government. This can either be laws, policies, or programs in all sectors and at all levels. So, including a gender perspective comprises the consequences that this is going to have for women and men. And this includes any planned activity, including laws, policies, or programs in all sectors and at all levels. So I would like to ask you if within the public policy for small and medium enterprises that you have been analyzing, have you had any opportunity to include gender focus or a gender perspective? I can also select someone who is going to answer. So please feel free to answer this question. Who has been able to work with a gender perspective and who wants to share his or her experience? Okay, perfect. In El Salvador, the document includes the gender perspective. What document, sorry? The public policy document? Okay. And we're going to analyze this later on because sometimes we can understand a gender perspective as, for instance, a gender language, or we can also consider that there is open information or disaggregated information depending on women and men, and or also different attention for women and men in order to solve a problem with different causes between women and men. So something that is very important is that many times it is considered that a public policy action can be neutral, and therefore nobody questions that if we are going to have different effects for women and men concerning the implementation of a program or policy. So we're going to move forward and we're going to talk about this. So including a gender perspective in decision making is has to do with developing a strategy in order to guarantee that the concerns of women and men are part of monitoring of public policies in every social, economic, and political sphere in order to provide benefits for both women and men and in order to not perpetuate inequality. The final objective is to achieve equality in all genders. And in order to do this, we have to have specific or different actions to be able to close these gender gaps. So, as we can see, there was a case in Mexico of a certain program that had to do with agricultural areas, and what they were looking for was to benefit women mainly. However, it was supposed to it was aimed at developing productive projects, and one of the requirements in order to provide this benefits was they had to prove tenure of or ownership of the land. In Mexico, less than 17% of the land ownership belongs to women. And also, we have many problems because this is sometimes not formally approved. So, of course, this is a big problem because only 17% of the land ownership belongs to women. So, of course, this program was not working because there were a lot of documents, and also this program was not including women because of course women were not able to provide these documents. So we need to take into account this type of details because they can be analyzed, and of course they are not including women. So as you might remember, some months ago when well, we were talking about the importance of posing a problem in a correct way in order to make decisions and to develop a theory of change in order to solve the causes of a problem. And in this way, we can make progress and we can do this in an efficient way. So, posing a problem, of course, is going to help us to avoid bias in decision making, and also this is going to help us to have less risk of being wrong when proposing a solution. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, what is the need, what is the problem, who is facing it? So when we are including a gender perspective, we need to know what is the need for women, what is the need for men, what is the problem that they are currently facing, and what is the problem that men are currently facing. What are the causes? For instance, they can be different for both women and men. And what are the effects? Because, of course, they are going to be different for men and women. And from this analysis, and if we include these questions, then we can ask ourselves, what is the ideal solution both for women and men? And in this way, we can determine the product or service that we want to deliver. So in this case, this is going to be for the indigenous population because sometimes it happens that when we talk about including a gender perspective in public policy, we also need to have a we need to include young people, senior citizens, indigenous population. So we are going to have different types of population that could be included in order to be able to develop better programs in order to attend the needs of to meet the needs of different types of of different groups. But of course, this is going to be more complex both for the interaction and for the design. And in order to include everyone, maybe in some cases we do not include a gender perspective. Maybe we're talking about 50% and 50% of the population, and that's why I think it is very important to include to first start with a gender perspective. Here in Mexico, there was a problem, and this problem had to do with higher rates of unemployment for women. And of course, this is a problem that happens both for women and for men, but of course, the causes are going to be different. And this program was operated by Sedesol, and they noticed that unemployment for women or the difficulties to have access to a job had to do with the fact of not having someone to take care of the children. So for men, of course, this was not a key cause for unemployment. So, in order to promote employment for women, they developed they care for children. So, as some of the causes, we had we and therefore they started offering these services, daycare facilities, and also they were granting a scholarship for these places if women took their children to these daycare facilities, and they were granting scholarships and they were allocating resources for these facilities in order to help in the care, for instance. And in this case, the same problem concerning unemployment, when we want to attend a problem concerning women, we're going to have a different solution that has to do with daycare facilities, for instance. And this is going to be different if we are attending men, because of course the causes are going to be different. So posing a problem is has to do with the fact that we are going to conduct this analysis, and we also have to make ourselves a question of how this is different for men and women, and we are going to analyze this problem in a better way. Something that is also very important to mention is that you might remember that we were talking about the problems tree. When we are analyzing problems and when we want to analyze a gender perspective, we are going to have a new variable for the analysis of the problem and also concerning the proposal of solutions. So if we do this in a right way, we're going to have more effective public policies, and also we're going to make progress in gender equality. So in order to do this, we have to conduct an analysis in a very specific way. So I would like to know if someone wants to let me know if you have been able to notice some differences and why women and men undertake any project concerning a small or a medium enterprise. Have you been able to analyze this? What are the different problems faced by both men and women? Please let me know if you want to share this. Okay, assets property as a support or guarantee, do you mean in order to be able to have an access to a credit, or in what sense do you mean? Okay, to have access to a credit. Yes. So when we talk about the credit example, this is going to be interesting. So someone else wants to say something? Okay, generally the assets are owned by men. Yes, you're right, because they are able to prove, or they have income, they can prove their income. So, okay, yes, I would like to make some questions, some guiding questions to design public policies with a gender perspective. So, concerning access to resources and benefits, one of the first questions is who has access to what information in the community? For instance, what I was saying before, sometimes men, because of their status or role, or because they are the main provider, suppliers, and because they are in contact with the society, maybe sometimes they have more information concerning different possibilities in order to have access to resources, credits, or something else. So we need to ask ourselves who has access to these resources and information. And of course, this is important to conduct our gender analysis. We also have to ask ourselves the different resources that both men and women have in the community. For instance, a resource without thinking about land or economic resources. We can think, for instance, in society, we're going to have some communities where women have more groups or are in contact with groups in comparison with men, because sometimes they are going to solve this in a different way, and women in community solve things in a collective way. So in this sense, women can have other women as a resource in comparison with men, or the other way. For instance, sometimes we can have some economic projects that involve men, and of course they have a support network, and in this way they can undertake a productive project in comparison with women. Maybe they stay at home and they do not have a direct contact with other people in the society. But usually women are housewives, and of course they need more time. For instance, in this sense, if we want women to be able to start their businesses, and maybe some of the causes, maybe this has to do with the fact that they have to take care of their children, so we have to develop new strategies in order to be able different problems at the same time. For instance, in the case that I was mentioning concerning daycare facilities, I think that it is very interesting that women in the community are the ones who who have the idea to have a daycare facility. And in that sense, these are women that start a business related to daycare facility. And of course, they hire more women, they have staff. And in this way, we're having like for instance, some women that were able to start a business, for instance, with a daycare facility, because maybe they had an extra room or an area for this. They have a business, and of course this solves one of the causes that explains why a woman cannot start a business, because they need to find the necessary area for this. And also this has to do with participation. Who does what in a community? What are the areas of interaction of both men and women in the community? So as Wendy says, for instance, if usually women stay at home and they take care of the children, of course they are not in direct contact with the society, and maybe in this case it is more likely that men are the ones who work, and of course the paid activities are conducted by men. And of course we need to analyze the activities conducted by both men and women in order to have a correct gender sensitive analysis. Something else that we need to ask ourselves is, if women are the ones in charge of taking the children to school and picking them up, then maybe we can think that maybe they do not have that much time, or maybe they only have free time when they pick their children from school. And of course this is going to be different for men, because they do not have that specific amount of time, and of course they can they can have more time than women. Another very important thing to take into account is who has the decision making power or control power within a community, who makes the decisions concerning resources. For instance, if we are in a scenario where men are the main suppliers, of course, within women are going to make decisions at home. So they are going to decide what they are going to buy within the home. So, of course, it is very important to get to know who makes the decisions in the community. So, as you can see here, answering these three important things, the access to resources and participation and the control power of resources, now we can analyze the different effects that we're going to have for men and women and how this is going to affect their well-being and their material conditions. And of course, if we get to know this dynamic, then this is going to help us to understand actions in order to close gaps between men and women. So as you might remember, as we have seen in the previous slide concerning diagnosis, when we analyze a current situation, what we were looking for is that a diagnosis is to have a diagnosis to be able to understand the causes and consequences of a problem. So in this case, we can make decisions to try to solve this problem and to obtain some specific results. So in order to be able to understand the problem, we had to pose the right questions. We had to ask ourselves and to be able to understand the causes, the situations, the effects of the problem. And this is going to help us to propose better solutions. So, of course, when we include a gender perspective, of course, we're going to have a more complex diagnosis, and we are going to have to analyze the current situation of both men and women in a different way in order to be able to understand the causes and consequences of a problem for men and women. And of course, we're going to have some elements in order to be able to make decisions to understand the problems related to men and women. And in this case, we're going to have results that are going to be maybe different for both men and women, but of course, they can help us to close gaps. For instance, assets ownership, to have access to a credit. In Mexico, we had a program that aimed at organizing land ownership, and at some point they had some specific actions to be able to have assets owned by women. So they started to facilitate the land ownership, the identification, and this action allowed to increase land ownership, asset ownerships, excuse me. So, of course, this action closed the gap concerning asset ownership, and this was very interesting. So, if they hadn't done this, maybe any program that did not make analyzed men and women in a different way, maybe this wouldn't have been done. So, as you might remember, we were talking about logical models, planning, public policies, and logical models. So when we were developing our logical model, what we were doing is that we were saying, okay, so the current situation is has to do with this, and our model. Now that we have understood the causes and effects, we know that if we do this and then certain assumptions are met, then we're going to have to obtain some results. So these causal models help us to to handle the a very complex problem. But of course, this is a model where we have some assumptions, and of course, we are going to isolate some of the causes and effects to be able to focus on solving some specific problems. So the question here is, how do we include a gender focus or a gender perspective in our logical models? So a few minutes ago, I was talking about the fact that when we conduct a diagnosis, we have to ask ourselves for the problem. We have to ask ourselves the causes and the effects of a problem, and we were starting to include a gender perspective. But when we think about the strategy, it is not only enough to have a set of activities or actions to conduct. We also need to think about the assumptions that have to be met that have to be met concerning men and women so that we can obtain specific results. So, of course, it is not enough to have a problem with a gender perspective. We also have to have actions, and we also need to include the assumptions that have to be met to be able to obtain the results that we want to obtain. So I included some of these schemes that we had already analyzed. So as you might remember, in the theory of change, we had some inputs to have activities, and these activities were transformed into products or goods and services that are delivered to the population. And when the population uses them, they have some results. And if these results are the right ones, then we are going to have the expected impact. So when we were including the assumptions and the indicators in our theory of change, what we had was a strategy. And in this case, we have a set of inputs, activities, and if the risk and assumptions are met, then we are going to have a set of products. And these products are going to render a result, and if some assumptions are met, then we are going to have an impact. So it is very important that for every single level in our strategy, we have indicators at the products level, at the results level, at the indicators level, and at the impact level. So when we are developing this logical model or this theory of change or intervention strategy, one of the questions that we need to ask ourselves is if the products that are going to be delivered to the population are the same for men and women. And we also need to ask ourselves if the assumptions and risks at each level are the same for both men and women. And also we need to be able to have information that is going to help us to measure the indicators concerning each level, disaggregated by gender. So as you might remember, the example that we were using before, this is the example by J. Paul for Latin America and the Caribbean. One of the questions that we were asking ourselves what are the obstacles concerning saving? And the answer was that one of the causes are the high withdrawal fees in banks, insufficient income to be able to have access to bank accounts, and the impossibility to meet documentary requirements, and misinformation about banking products, and so on and so forth. But analyzing the ones that we have in the slide, if we wanted to focus or to have a gender sensitive analysis of a problem, we need to ask ourselves if the obstacles concerning saving are the same for men and women. For instance, if the high withdrawal fees, if uh, if if they are related to these fees, then maybe they are going to be different for both men and women depending on the income. For instance, maybe for some men, the income is enough to pay some fees, and of course, and maybe they can save more. And this has to do with different incomes. So insufficient income maybe is a cause, and of course this is going to affect men and women in a different way, and the impossibility to meet documentary requirements is also going to be different for men and women. For instance, if we are in a community where many women work at home, maybe they are not going to have a something to prove that they are working, and of course maybe they are not going to meet the the requirements for a savings account, and maybe men have a formal employment and they meet the requirements. And maybe also misinformation about banking products is going to be different for men and women, because maybe women are aware of the fact of the banking products, maybe because they listen to it in the radio, and maybe men read about it in newspapers. So of course we need to analyze the problem with a gender perspective. We need to ask ourselves questions concerning the problem, the causes, and the effects. So if we move forward, and if what we want to do is to have a strategy to increase saving, or to do this, then the solution has to do with decreasing the withdrawal fees and decreasing card issuance costs. And the question that I would like to ask you, and I would like you to think about this: should we do something different in this solution that I am currently mentioning to have the expected effect on men and women? So, do you think that if we decrease withdrawal fees, and if we only have one product that operates in the same way for women and men, do you think that we can close the gap, the gender gap? So, let's think about this. Do you want to say something? What do you think? So, the question would be, so in order to decrease the costs and in order to increase saving, do we have to have the same strategy for men and women? Because in this case, we have decreasing withdrawal fees and decreasing card issuance costs. So, in order to be able to foster saving in women, how can we develop this strategy? How can we focus on this problem, and how can we help women in this case? So, Leticia says that we can have specific programs with different conditions. For instance, decreasing withdrawal fees. For instance, maybe if we have a program that says, okay, so in order to incentivize savings, we are going to allow 5 withdrawals per month without fees. Maybe those 5 withdrawals are okay for men that are going to withdraw once per week, because maybe there is a bank close to their job. But maybe for women, this is going to be dangerous, withdrawing so many resources at the same time. So maybe they need to withdraw less money, but but more times in a month, because maybe they buy twice per week. So as we can see here, this is going to be really helpful, or this is going to be more relevant for men than for women than for men, for instance. So as you might remember this table that we were previously analyzing, and so we can say that the need has to do with increasing formal savings. The problem is that there are high bank withdrawal fees. So the solution would be decreasing withdrawal transaction fees, and an alternative solution would be advertising accounts for the poorest ones. So we had a design or a solution that was having a bank account with a free debit card that lowers the cost of making bank withdrawals. So as we have this table right now, of course this doesn't include a gender perspective because we are not analyzing if this has to do with men and women or men and not women in poverty. So the solution that has to do with decreasing withdrawal transaction fees can be very different for men and women, as we were previously saying. Advertising accounts for the first ones can require a different strategy in order to reach men and to reach women. So if we know that men go to work and are in a direct contact with 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 a society, then of course this is going to be more relevant for men. But maybe for women, we can advertise this in the TV because they spend more time at home. So in this way, we are thinking in a we are including a gender perspective. So as you might remember, when we were talking about a theory of change, we had this example: low savings in in a in for the population in poverty. So we have the objectives, the inputs of products, clients opening accounts and receiving free debit cards. As an intermediate result, we would expect that the amount of money saved in bank increases, and as an impact, savings increases, and this includes investment, consumption, durable goods, fluctuations, and so on. So, from another point of view, here in the inputs, we had a bank account operating in accordance with its original design or designed in a relevant way to solve the problems. And we had the products, and in this case we needed to have lower withdrawal fees. As an intermediate result, we had the number of cash withdrawals and amounts with the balances that remain in the accounts. And concerning the impact, we are interested in the savings balance so that they can, and through time we can have a better investment in assets, consumption, and income. So if in this case we include a gender perspective, then maybe we need to consider that the indicators or the rate of accounts, and we need to analyze if the rate of accounts is higher in women than in men, and then we can talk about the fact that we're closing gaps. Or maybe we can analyze the savings balance, the average saving balance in men and women, because if we only analyze a diagnosis that says that in average women save 40%, maybe we want to close this gap and we want to say that women save almost as almost 50%, and of course this implies an increase in savings, and this is going to help to close gaps. So in this case we can see how this increases the savings, and this is going to help us to analyze if our policy is achieving what we want to achieve. So also maybe we can design the strategy just as the one that we have here without closing gaps. Of course, many strategies are designed, and maybe some of them are designed, and maybe we say, okay, I can design the same intervention, and it is not going to have a gender perspective. And it is not because it was designed in this way that a policy is not going to have a different effect in men and women. And many times, evaluation with evaluation with a gender perspective analyzes men and women in a different way, even if the original design didn't include a gender perspective. So this is very important because this is going to help us to understand that maybe some policies or programs without a gender perspective can increase gaps, or maybe they can close gaps. So it is not because something was not designed without a gender perspective that it cannot be evaluated with a gender perspective to be able to analyze the effects that it is having on the access to credits, assets, average savings balance of a specific kind, and so on. So I think that I was forgetting something very important, because it is very important to talk about what does it mean to evaluate with a gender perspective. We are going to analyze some basic concepts. So there are many definitions of a gender sensitive evaluation, but something that is very important to say is that this is a work line of the evaluation that is still being developed. We have had some very important experiments in order to include gender perspective in evaluation. However, we do not have a specific route to path to follow, because of course there are many theories of change, or then programs, or maybe the other way. And when we want to measure the impact concerning gender, we need to analyze this case by case. But we're going to talk about some basic concepts that are very important to take into account. So for a woman, a gender-sensitive evaluation is a systematic and impartial evaluation that provides credible, reliable, and evidence-based information about the degree to which an intervention has achieved progress or lack thereof towards expected and or unforeseen outcomes in terms of gender equality and women empowerment. So I want to highlight in red, we are talking about the expected and the unforeseen outcomes. So this has to do with what I was previously mentioning, because maybe we have an intervention that includes a gender perspective, and it aims at achieving results concerning women empowerment, but maybe there are some interventions that do not include a gender perspective, but maybe they do achieve some results concerning gender equality and women empowerment. For instance, an unexpected outcome would be perpetuating inequality. And of course, it is not going to be likely that a program would want to increase inequality, because they want to make progress in concerning women empowerment or gender equality, but maybe there are going to be unexpected effects, and it is very important to be able to identify them. According to the gender institution, the gender evaluation, or the this is applied as a method that includes a gender perspective concerning its usage. And for instance, a gender sensitive evaluation is a systematic and impartial evaluation that provides credible information, and this has to do with the results planning of a project with gender perspective. Something that I have seen, and I think that this is a mistake, is that sometimes we conduct an evaluation without gender perspective, but there is a chapter included that talks about gender perspective. So of course this means that gender perspective concerning a project was analyzed in the framework of an evaluation, and not that there was a gender sensitive evaluation, because a gender sensitive evaluation from the very design includes questions like the ones we were analyzing at the beginning, and these questions have to do with the fact that an intervention is including more women in decision making, if they have access to some resources or assets, if this is closing gaps, and so on. So, of course, it is going to be different to include a gender analysis in the evaluation than designing an evaluation with a gender perspective. So, in the first definition, why do we care so much about the unexpected and expected results concerning women empowerment and gender equality? I think that it is very important because even when gender inequality is not included within the explicit objectives of a policy, it can have an impact on it because it is highly unlikely that we're going to have neutral policies. And of course, it is very important in the execution and in the evolution. It is very important to ask ourselves what happens concerning inequality, even if this policy seems neutral. And something else that is also very important concerning the unexpected or expected results is because in order to be able to achieve results that are expected concerning gender equality, we have to have some assumptions during the implementation of the programs. We have to meet several assumptions, and these are the external elements to the programs that can have a direct influence on the results. So, of course, when we include a gender perspective in evaluation, it is very important, and we have to evaluate if the assumptions are met in order to be successful, and to analyze the results that we are achieving, and if we are making progress in women's empowerment and gender equality. So again, in practice, for instance, we can have a discrimination phenomenon that can increase inequality. And this has to do with the fact that maybe the operational rules of a program or the target population are men and women, and maybe there is a specific social reason or some requirements in order to have access. And in this case, this is a discriminatory program, maybe because it is not including women or it is not including men, and maybe this program wants to include both. So, in that sense, evaluating a gender perspective has to do with the fact that we need to analyze the differences between both genders. So, something that has been happening in Mexico during the 20 years of the Prospera program is how it has analyzed, how it has included a gender perspective. When it started, it was found, and of course it was something that was very important. It was found that when they were delivering resources to women, it was better than delivering it to men. So in some way they say, okay, it is better to deliver resources to women because the investment return is higher in comparison with men, because they tended to invest less in the development of their families. So, in some way, since the very beginning of this program, they thought that this was a program designed with a gender perspective because they were prioritizing attention to women. However, I think that this was a something not very clear because they were selecting the beneficiary because she was the best intermediary to achieve the objectives, and they were not thinking if by including women as beneficiaries, maybe they were perpetuating the 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 care the some specific role, for instance, at home. And of course, they were not analyzing the problems that could happen because maybe women had they were more powerful, they had more power, so of course they were able to have access to more resources, and in some cases this can close gaps, for instance in decision making in homes, but also this can cause major conflicts between men and women. So in some cases, if we evaluate with a gender perspective the impact of these programs, we have to analyze, for instance, what happened with men that were working when they knew that they were going to receive money transfers, and maybe maybe they stopped working because of course they knew that they were going to have an income. So we need to ask ourselves the impact on men and women within a home concerning this program. And also, we can ask ourselves what would be the difference between genders that happens from an intervention from, for instance, support to women entrepreneurship. What happens when women work instead of staying at home? What happens with men? Do they work more? Do they work less? Is there some sort of difference? Because what happens? Do they stay at home? Who takes care of the children? So, of course, we're going to have some questions that are going to be very important in the framework of gender sensitive evaluations. So, another thing that is very important is to talk about gender perspective in a program. Gender perspective is a concept that is included in the international agreements signed by almost every single Latin American country, and they talk about introducing the gender perspective in public policies. So, what does it mean? Well, for the National Institute of Women in Mexico, introducing gender perspective in a program, project, or public policy implies that the mechanisms, instruments, and strategies in this program or project have been designed to achieve a resource allocation that ensures equity and benefits both men and women in the target population in any of these programs. So, what does it mean? Well, gender perspective in the design of the programs is going to achieve a better distribution between both men and women concerning this benefits. So, in that sense, if we evaluate with a gender perspective, then we need to analyze the actual trends and the situation and the expected results of a public policy, action, or program both for men and women. So, something that has happened and that is very important to mention is that during the past administration, the past 6 years, we have within our National Development Plan, we had a program, a transversal program that indicated that every single sector program and public policies had to be designed with a gender perspective. However, something that is very important to mention is that the ones who can implement and design actions are the public institutions, and they are the ones that do not always have a gender perspective within their own institutions. So they are not aware of gender equality, and of course, they do not have a gender perspective. So the ones who are making decisions do not have a gender perspective, and they do not have enough knowledge concerning this, and the institutions are not designed to be able to operate with a gender perspective, then of course this is going to be very likely that within the institutions and also the activities and programs are not going to include a gender perspective. So that's why in Mexico there has been an important investment concerning gender mainstreaming, and this aims at transferring resources so that the institutions understand and implement a gender perspective, and in this way the programs and actions of those institutions are going to be designed with a gender perspective. So when we talk about conducting a gender sensitive evaluation, how can we do this? Well, beyond the gender experts in the subject matter, it is very important that the evaluation teams have gender experts. A gender sensitive evaluation has to take into account a gender perspective, the evaluation criteria, in the evaluation methodologies, in the evaluation questions that are going to be used to evaluate, in the indicators, in the instruments, in the databases, and in the creation of information, in the processing of this information, and lastly, in the reports. So, in this sense, what I want to say is that gender perspective has to be an integral part of an evaluation and not just a section in a report. So, for instance, last year I was able to evaluate, maybe you have already seen a results evaluation, and I had to evaluate the results consistency of the gender perspective program from the federal government. So something that was very important is that I was evaluating a program that aims at closing the gap and including a gender perspective in the federal government and in the state government. But when I was analyzing this evaluation, I noticed that they were not designed with a gender perspective because the evaluation questions didn't allow to have an a priori analysis because they did not include a gender perspective. So the problem here is that for that same year, there was some pilot questions in other reference terms of other programs that did not necessarily wanted to achieve gender equality, but they were using those instruments. So what we had to do is to include within our team a gender expert so that even if the reference terms did not provide this information, what we did is within the instruments, indicators, processing, and reports, we incorporated a gender perspective in that specific evaluation. So I will, if you want, I can share the link. This was a public evaluation, and I think that this was very interesting for the National Institute for Women. It was very interesting to see how we achieve this for the gender mainstreaming. I think that maybe this sounds very repetitive, but this made a great difference, and that's why we submitted that evaluation for and now there is a new team that is going to evaluate the processes in that same program, and in that case that was the same case. They did not have the necessary reference terms, so we said okay, so include that so that we can have a gender perspective in this evaluation in that specific program that wanted to achieve equality between men and women. So what I want to say is that it doesn't happen just because this is an activity that has to be conducted, and of course the evaluation, we need to have gender experts in order to have a specialized work. So in that sense, now I am going to talk about some key questions for gender sensitive evaluation. So within evaluation criteria, we have four groups. The first one has to do with the relevance of the intervention. So the questions are the following: does the intervention contribute effectively to the creation of favorable conditions for gender equality? I think that this question can be very interesting if we ask this question in the framework of the programs that you are analyzing. For instance, we need to ask ourselves if the intervention is is going to achieve results. Another question, does it respond to women's practical and strategic gender needs or not? Was emphasis to gender equality issues during the implementation phase logical and coherent with this needs? And sometimes it happens that we have programs that are well designed and do have a gender perspective, but maybe they do have structures that are not the right ones. So in that way, they are not going to operate and they are not going to achieve the results. For instance, um, when a program is promoted, maybe we are going to need to have actions depending on each gender. For instance, maybe sometimes we can go to schools because we know that women, including the target population, are going to be there. But maybe if we do not include a gender perspective, maybe we're going to go to some other places, and in those places, we're going to find more men, or maybe we need to do this in different places if we want to reach both men and women. Another question is, were adjustments made to respond to external factors of the program that influence gender relations? For instance, an economic crisis that can be an external factor to the program. Maybe the economic crisis is going to affect in a different way men and women, and therefore the operation of the program has to be adjusted. So, analyzing other evaluation criteria besides relevance, maybe we have to analyze efficiency. For instance, the implementation has the implementation been efficient concerning gender equality? What resources and means are being used, and are they being used in an efficient way to achieve benefits for both men and women? We can ask ourselves if the results for both men and women have been reached in an accessible, affordable costs, and if the resources had been allocated. Maybe we know that an a priori entrepreneurship is more expensive for women than men because maybe the resources that are going to be allotted is going to be women are going to need more resources. So if that is the case, of course, it is going to be more expensive, but we're going to have a cost benefit relation that is going to be reasonable concerning the one that we are using to be able to reach the same benefits in men. And if, for instance, we set a goal concerning costs without having a difference for men and women, then when we analyze costs, maybe this is going to be very high. But if we make a difference between men and women, then we're going to notice that maybe we're going to have to spend more resources on women, but maybe this is going to be related to an objective that we want to achieve. Also, we can ask ourselves, we can talk about another criteria that has to do with effectiveness. So, in that sense, what we would be asking ourselves is if the results of the program were effective, for instance, in achieving gender equality in a direct way. So this question would be very relevant in the case of those programs that in an explicit way want to achieve gender equality. Another question would be, for instance, if the results have contributed, if the intervention has contributed to the results and expected results, if they have had some benefit for men and women. And for instance, we can also ask ourselves for some gender sensitive evaluation if the stakeholders that participated in the program were benefit from the teams. This can we can ask ourselves this in, for instance, some programs that aimed to achieve gender mainstreaming, for instance. Another very important criteria has to do with sustainability. One question is the achievements in gender equality are going to be sustained after the program. So maybe this is going to be just an effect that is not going to last. So we have to have something so that they can last through time. Another, maybe it is going to be different from for different groups. Another question has to do with the extent in what the needs of both men and women have been analyzed, and of course this is going to have to do with women rights. Another question has to do with the with gender mainstreaming. For instance, in small and medium enterprises, it is very interesting to see, for instance, to analyze if there had been productive activities that have lasted and if they are related to men and women, if these activities have been promoted, or if, for instance, we this program has achieved to close the gap. For instance, a dealership is something that is done by men. For instance, a strategy for concerning small and medium enterprises would be to provide workshops for women so that they can work. And in this case, we would be fostering gender equality because in this case, women are doing what men do. But also, this can happen the other way around. We can also try to include men in women activities, for instance. So, as you might remember, we were already talking about this because a very important measurement in the interventions design is to have the correct indicators. As we might remember, indicators help us to have verifiable measurements to be able to have a standard against which to assess, estimate, or demonstrate progress. So, an indicator has to provide information on progress in meeting a goal. And as you might remember, we had some strategic indicators that were related to effective efficiency, the achievement of results, and we had other management indicators related to the operation of the programs. So if we keep talking about our example, then as an input we have a bank account with free withdrawals, and as an indicator we we need to analyze the amount of accounts offered. If we have the products, if as products we have clients opening accounts for free, then maybe we can also monitor the amount of clients that have received a free credit card. So as an intermediate result, we have the population that saves money in the banks, and of course we also want to measure the amount of deposits. So in this case, it is very interesting to analyze the amount of deposits by men and by women because maybe this is going to be related to an intervention design that is different for both men and women. Maybe the average balance for men and women is going to be different. The number of times that women go to make withdrawals is going to be different. So as impact, we would have this increase in formal in savings increases, investment, consumption, durable goods, fluctuations, and then we would like to measure the average saving and the difference between men and women, how does it change between men and women, and so on. So if we knew, just as you were saying before, if we knew that the assets ownership has a gender bias because assets ownership is generally owned by men. Maybe one of the objectives that we're going to achieve is that maybe some types of investment are going to be conducted by made by women or by women who invest in something, and in this way we are supporting women, and this is going to be a higher rate of women, and in this way we're closing gender gaps. So some example concerning indicators with gender perspective are the following ones. It is very important that you analyze this. For instance, scholarships granted by sex. When a scholarship is granted, of course we are going to have to analyze the rate, and the indicator would be the percentage of men and women. So some of the programs are only concerned, and in this case we need to analyze the rate of women and men that were granted a scholarship. So this is a coverage subject. Also, something that would be very important is to analyze the municipal presidents, that we have the municipal presidents by sex. And in this case, it shows the municipal presidents by sex that allocate resources for programs or projects that promote gender equity with respect to the total of municipal presidents by states. And this is going to be related to coverage of jobs generated by the program by sex of the beneficiary population. So if gender mainstreaming is being achieved, then we're going to see that municipal presidents that are men and that are women are do have a gender perspective and programs with a gender perspective. Another indicator would be the coverage of programs in accordance to the sex, in accordance to the sex of the beneficiary population. In accordance, so I think that these are typical indicators. But as I mentioned before, 50% and 50% is not only doesn't mean that we have achieved gender with this. We are just talking about rates, and 60% of the jobs created by a program, and that this just are for women. So in this case, we would be closing the gap. Another example concerning indicators has to do with beneficiaries by sex in decision-making positions within the program, and this has to do with the institutional organization. And this would be the percentage of male and female beneficiaries in decision-making positions within the program by sex with respect to the total population of the program. For instance, in those entrepreneurship programs or beneficiary programs that can be either men or women, I think that it would be very interesting making positions last year. For instance, there was a program known as Fomenta to sell. Many times they are couples, for instance, men and women, and children, and maybe they can they it, in this case we have mixed. I think that it would be very interesting to analyze the different decision-making positions in those groups. Another indicator would be the beneficiary population by sex with access to property by type of property, and this is a percentage of men and women which are beneficiaries of the program according to ownership and type of property with respect to the total number of beneficiaries, and this is something that we were mentioning before. Something that is very important, and I want to mention this again, is that we can conduct gender sensitive evaluations even in programs that do not have a gender perspective, and maybe this is going to have an unexpected effect, either positive in gender equality. Something else is that we can have examples or programs to identify in a preventive way a negative consequence on equality between men and women in order to formulate or feedback or provide a feedback to practically promote gender equality. And in this slides, I'm going to talk about other things to take into account in gender sensitive monitoring and evaluation. For instance, in evaluation, control, and monitoring, a monitoring system is necessary in order to have fair programs. A fair policy has to have mechanisms which are expression of the state's willingness to monitor with the policy, and this is going to help us to measure the follow-up mechanisms of the policy. For instance, what has been the effect of the women. There are mechanisms between civil society and the state to ensure policy. All are basic things that a monitoring and evaluation system should have a gender sensitive monitoring and evaluation system. So this has been a struggle for women because we need to have statistical information for the design of a policy and for the follow up. This has to be disaggregated by men and women. We have to have data and inventories to be able to have strategies consistent with the political commitments of the national authorities. And also, the production of information is part of the sustainability strategy of a policy, right? And also, it constitutes a contribution for the creation of new policies on the subject. So, something that is very important is that we need to guarantee that in monitoring and evaluation, there is an institutional mechanism for the production of information on this policy. This has to be public, and there have to be like legal mechanisms with this. And we can also talk about the results. What are the results? The policy tips, the progress, implementation the impact of the policy on women's status, a universal policy, and some elements the implementation of the policy as an evaluation with a gender perspective. We need to analyze if an intervention shows gender inequalities that and if we have to solve them through another policy. So this is basically everything I had ready for this class. But if you have any questions, please let me know. I am going to leave some references and references concerning this question. An evaluation guideline. We also have an evaluation with gender perspective, human rights. Also, I included a study concerning gender perspective in Mexico and in rural communities, and I think that this is very important. And I am also going to share a reference by Coneval. Also, I shared a document from a seminary, and this has to do with the of